You're starting your DIY projects and thinking about taking them to the next level? What if I add LEDs? Or what about to connect a motor to make it move on its own? You watched a video on the best way to understand electricity and decide it's time to apply it to your projects. So, you head to the nearest hardware store, buy a soldering iron, and make your first soldering attempt. Something like this. I also started from scratch, soldering with somewhat primitive techniques, without a proper guidance, and had many frustrating moments. Even during my university days, they didn't teach us. They just assumed that we already knew and assigned us projects. After many years of practice and understanding the fundamental concepts of soldering, I was able to get a PCB inspector certification and discovered that soldering is very easy if you know the right technique. Let me show to you the best way to solder from scratch at home and achieve professional level soldering effortlessly. When you want to make connections, you can splice wire by twisting the copper to establish an electrical connection, or you can use a connector for this task. This results in a bulky and unpractical joint, and it only works for wires. Soldering is a metal joining process that involves melting and bonding two or more pieces by applying heat and a filler material, typically using solder or tin as the filler material in electronic soldering. Working with solder involves heating it until it melts, and then applying it to connections to create a solder joint when it cools and solidifies. These are the basic materials needed for soldering: a soldering iron, tin, and flux. The soldering iron melts the solder, and the flux facilitates the flow. You can start with just this. Let's look at each of these and what alternatives are available in the market based on our possibilities. Something I always try to emphasize is that having quality tools is crucial for every job, but it's most important to understand their function to use them better. A good maker knows how to make the most of their resources. The soldering iron is the fundamental tool for soldering. There are many types, and I prefer pencil type ones because they offer better control. You can get a simple one directly connected to the wall that heats up. If you want to upgrade a bit, I recommend two features: adjustable temperature to match the solder you use, and interchangeable tips. Make sure you can get new tips in the future when the current one wears out, or to choose the best tip for each job. A soldering iron that meets these features is this one. Another one like this is a bit more expensive, but has better temperature control, and there's even a version where you can connect it with a USB Type-C. You know, for on-the-go soldering. Solder is the most used metal as a soldering filler material, and it's an alloy of tin, copper, gold, silver, and lead. In the industrial world, the use of lead in solder makes it flow more easily in components. Personally, I haven't noticed a difference when soldering with lead-free solder. I recommend avoiding the use of lead and other hazardous materials for health. You can select your solder depending on the alloy, melting temperature, and the amount of flux it contains. Many of them have a card with flags, so when soldering, the solder and flags melt together to facilitate soldering. Speaking of flags, it is a material used to facilitate soldering by preventing oxidation and promoting the flow of solder. Flags can come in liquid, paste, or gel form. There are two types: non-active or inert flags can be used as is, and there is also active flags that contains agents to clean and remove rust from surfaces for better fusion with the solder. You must clean these flags because, if you leave it, it will degrade the copper over time. For this, the most practical thing is to use isopropyl alcohol, but make sure beforehand that your flags dissolve in alcohol. Other additional accessories that will make your life much easier are wire strippers, isopropyl alcohol, and cotton swabs to clean the flags. It's also very useful to have a third hand that allows you to hold where you're going to solder. Tweezers for very small components or for holding components without burning yourself. And finally, my all-time favorite tool, pliers. But not this, flat nose pliers. In times of scarcity, you can also use this as a cable stripper and as tweezers, besides using it to cut ends of cables and components to their final size. Before starting to solder, we must talk about the most important thing: safety. Hey, don't skip this because you'll find a couple of low-budget tips. If your task is repairing a component or connecting something additional, remember that everything must be de-energized. Disconnect the device, remove batteries if it has any, and thus avoid the risk of electric shocks and damaging the existing circuit. We'll be working with a soldering iron that will be at least 250 Celsius, which means that improper use can cause burns. Designate a specific area to place the soldering iron, and try to get a soldering iron holder for added safety. If for any reason you get burned, put the affected area under tap water at room temperature. Do not use ice-cold water. After 15 minutes, assess the injury and decide if it requires medical assistance. When solder melts, it releases gases. These gases are not heavy metals. It is the flux evaporating, but we still need to mitigate any health risks. For this, the cheapest alternative will be to solder in a well-ventilated area. You can use a fan to redirect the smoke outside, or you can use a smoke extractor with an activated carbon filter like this one. Finally, a safety point for our components. If you live in a place with very low humidity, electrostatic discharges causes our bodies to charge to thousands of volts, and touching a component basically overloads them and internally damages them. To avoid this, you can use ESD dissipation mats and even grease straps with a grounding point. In my case, I don't have that problem, but you might depending on where you live. If you're interested in continuing to learn, subscribe to this channel. If you want to receive more tips, tricks, and extra information, you can join my free Maker Metals newsletter. Check the link in the description. Okay, now let's start our work. For this, step number 1 is wash our hands thoroughly. With dirty hands, we can impregnate components with oils and make the solder process difficult. Also, clean your workspace. The neater your work area, the fewer chances of accidents. We'll start by splicing 2 cables. For this, take your wire strippers, use the hole corresponding to the gauge of your cable, and remove the insulation enough to splice. Here I show you a basic twist to splice cables. Then, apply a generous amount of flux on the copper. Heat the area of interest afterwards. If the surfaces aren't hot, the solder won't flow correctly. This usually takes about 2 or 3 seconds. Once the flux is hot, it will melt and we can apply the solder. Apply the solder in the middle between the copper and the tip. Apply enough solder so that the entire surface looks silver, and let it cool naturally without blowing. It's not necessary to create a solder ball. Finally, cover it with electrical tape or heat shrink tubing. With this, we fulfill the main function of electronic soldering, which is to ensure electrical contact between components. Now we will solder cables to a pad, like in this LED strip. For this, we need to pre-thin the cables. This means we strip the cable, add flux, and then apply solder only to the cable. We will also pre-thin the pads. Once it's done, we are ready to solder our cable. Heat the pad until the solder is liquid again. Join the cable to the pad and wait until you see that the solder on the cable has melted. Use the soldering iron to try to speed up the process. The soldering should be quick to avoid degrading the metals. Finally, you can clean the residue with alcohol using a cotton swab. Now let's see how to solder components on a board. The most commonly used components by hobbyists, both in the past and now, are THT, which stands for Through Hole Technology. This is because the component legs pass through the board. There are boards with non-metallized holes, which means that we have to solder both sides of the board if it has copper on both faces. Metallized holes have copper on the whole walls, so if we want to solder both layers of the board, we only need to solder on one side, but we must ensure that the solder flows through the entire hole. To solder these components, we need to insert the component into the hole, spread the legs to hold it in place, and apply flux and solder. Again, we will heat up the pad and the component for about 2 or 3 seconds. Apply the solder until it melts and maintain the heat for 1 more second. This is valid for resistors, capacitors, diodes, and all 2-pin components. For 3 or more pins, bend at least 2 legs to fix it and solder all the pins. This applies to transistors, MOSFETs, and ICs. When you're done, use the pliers to remove the excess pins. Use protective glasses to prevent accidents. SMD components stands for Surface Mount Device and are currently used because they require less space by not having holes, allowing for more components in less space. This is especially useful in portable devices like cell phones or complex devices like computers. To solder these elements, the principle is the same, but the technique varies. In this case, we will add solder to one of the pads, a small amount, then add to the other pad and join the component. Once the solder flows on the component, we can solder the other one. This will work for most SMD components. The idea is to have an initial point of the component to be held, and then we can solder the other pins. For some occasions, it's better use a finer tip, especially for fine pitch components. Be patient and you'll be able to solder the components. Don't forget to clean the soldering with alcohol when finished. The correct shape of a soldering joint should be as follows. A conical figure representing that the solder is correctly adhered and in the right amount. This is the perfect solder. It should look shiny, smooth, and without protrusion or holes. This is the international standard for quality soldering. I'm working on a complete masterclass of how to master soldering. In it, I'll talk about details and even more advanced concepts that will allow you to become a soldering master. Enter the link in the description to find out about the launch. For repair jobs, you'll probably need to desolder components. For this, we'll use a solder extractor and solder wick. The method of use is as follows. Heat the area. Add a bit of flux or solder. Once the solder is liquid, quickly bring the extractor close and press the trigger. This will suck the solder. Repeat this as many times as necessary to release the pin. For SMD soldering, you probably won't reuse the SMD component, so the fastest way is make a solder ball that covers both sides of the component and, in a sweeping motion, remove it. And then clean the pad with a solder wick. Over time, you'll gain more skills in soldering. If you follow this guide, I can confidently say that you are ahead of over 70% of engineers I know. But if you want to be in the top 5% of makers, there's still something you need to master to create unbeatable projects. Click on this video to find out.